Hey Gen Max, in this video I'm going to be explaining the retirement visa options that exist in Mexico. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the why you would want to move to Mexico in your retirement or pre-retirement in my case. Also the requirements that you're going to go through, the types of visas that you can get. I'm going to talk to you about the application process, and finally I'm going to finish up with some tips. So why would you want to retire in Mexico? This will be a really quick section. I do talk about this a lot on my channel, but healthcare, affordable and high quality. Let's talk about affordability. It's much more affordable to live the life that you want to live down in Mexico, especially if you're looking at extending your working years in the US to be able to live out your life the way you want to, or just never even getting to the point where you can live out the life the way you want to in the US, even if you work more hours or more years. And that is, of course, to get the quality of life that you want. And the quality of life is wonderful in Mexico. The people are really great. The pace of life is slower. There's not as much divisive political stuff going on as there is in the US or even Canada. So the quality is really wonderful when you're talking about moving to Mexico. Culture in Mexico, beyond just the people, but the culture that is here, just the way people are, but also some of the history and the arts, things like that. Wonderful in Mexico. You can go see you can live in a town that is like living in Europe in terms of the historic Spanish architecture, things like that, without having to go so far. And speaking of so far, Mexico is close to the United States, so it is very convenient to be a retiree if you want to come back and into the United States to visit family, to visit grandchildren, things like that. Really easy to get there compared to some areas like Asia or even Europe. And of course, there's the climate in Mexico, and it's not always hot and sunny in Mexico. There are areas that you can go to the beaches where it's going to be hot and sunny a good chunk of the year. Also, you could be somewhere like close to San Diego where it doesn't get quite so hot in the summer, or inland. There are great spots inland that are at higher elevations that have a more moderate climate year-round. So lots of options in terms of climate, but for the most part, the climate seems to be better than it is in the US or even Canada. So I titled this video Retirement Visa Options because that's what YouTube told me. This is actually a new thing on YouTube. Tab just showed up today that said, we think you should make this video about retirement visa options in Mexico. So really, there's not a retirement visa per se in Mexico, just like there's not a digital nomad visa. So a lot of countries have these very specific visas for different people, or a pensioner's visa or something like that. In Mexico, really, there are permanent residency visas, temporary residency visas, and tourist visas. And sometimes those tourist visas are really just tourist permits. But there are a couple of different ways to get to those. So that's what I'm going to cover today. What is most common for people who are retiring or who are getting close to retirement, really, which is who this channel is for. I love to encourage people to retire early by moving to Mexico, or to move to Mexico and still be continuing working in the United States if you're working remotely, to do that and then work towards retirement, or just kind of slow life down a little bit in your retirement years. And there is one more option. If you've been to Mexico in the past, that might be an option for you. It's called regularization. It's like an amnesty program. But let's go into those different types now, and we'll start with the requirements. Pretty much the big requirements that people consider are the financial requirements. There are also some requirements like you can't be convicted of certain crimes. Not a lot of people are getting hooked up or getting caught up in that, so that's not so much of a problem. But it is something to consider. If you've been convicted of a major crime in the United States, it might be a problem for you. But most people are looking at the financial requirements. So let's take them one by one: temporary, permanent, and then tourist, and then the regularization program. So each of these kind of has two different ways that you typically go about it, either with a monthly income or with an amount of money in the bank. Now, there's also the ability, sometimes if you buy a house worth like $500,000 or something like that, you might be able to go that way, but some consulates don't allow that. So I'm going with the most common things here. So temporary residency, if you're looking at what your monthly income needs to be in 2025. Now, it's 2024. This isn't all official yet. And also the exchange rate changes. So depending on how the exchange rate is when they set the numbers, things will change depending on the consulate. Some consulates require more than these numbers. Some consulates require less than these numbers. What I like to use as a guide is the Mexico Relocation Guide. And I'm going to have a link down below. It'll be the first link you see. Will be a link over to the specific page on the Mexico Relocation Guide that talks about the financial requirements for residency. Usually Mariana has like the different consulates, what people have reported to her are the requirements for that specific consulate and the official dollar amounts that you're going to need. But generally in 2025, if you make $4,700 a month, and that works out to about a $56,000 salary, that will allow you to qualify for residency. Now what you're gonna have to do is take in your pay stubs to the consulate. I'm gonna talk about the actual application process, but you're gonna show those pay stubs that show that you've got that $4,700 a month of income. And for 6 months or so is pretty typical, but you'll have to go with whatever consulate, whatever their rules are. Now, the other option is to go with how much money is in your bank account. Now, your bank account could be your savings account, your checking account, your IRA, your 401k, anything with your name on it is going to be possible to show that you have, in this case, around 78,000 US dollars. If you have that in the bank and you can show it, once again, it has to be there for at least 6 months or a year, something like that. So it's not money that you just kind of like borrowed from someone, put it in there, and you're going to give it right back to them just to show this. They want to see that for sure that you have this amount of money in your bank account. And they have these financial requirements to make sure that you're not going to become a burden on society in Mexico. And these numbers have gotten really large. So the amount of money you need to live in Mexico is much, much lower than the amount of money the government requires you to have to get your residency in Mexico. So about 5 years ago, when my wife and I went through this process, the numbers were about half this. And it's because minimum wage has been going up in Mexico significantly for the past 5 years or so. And all of these numbers are based on a formula that is based on minimum wage. So when minimum wage goes up, these numbers go up. But they've gotten really pretty big. And I'm guessing at some point in the future, Mexico is going to redo the formula because minimum wage had been stagnant for a long time. But then it started to go up under the last president. So minimum wage going up is great. But the way the formula works, it might not be great for you if you're working on trying to qualify with these financial requirements. And fees, you're going to pay about $650 in fees to go through the process to get your temporary residency. Now that's fees over a 4-year period because your temporary residency is a 4-year temporary process that you have to renew after the first year and maybe every year. But so each year you have to pay some of those fees, but that's about what it adds up to. Now, there is another option in terms of if you don't meet those financial requirements, if you're married to someone who meets the permanent requirements, or you're married to someone who has reached the permanent requirements, and I'll talk about that too in a second, or you're married to a Mexican citizen, you're able to get your temporary residency through a different process, through having that marital relationship. And marital relationship does include non-traditional forms of marriage. So you don't have to have necessarily a marriage certificate, but if you are partnered up with someone, you should be able to go through the process of getting your temporary residency based on the person that you are a partner with. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there because that's not quite as common, but it is something out there that you should know about. So after the 4 years, once you've gone through the temporary residency process, you'll be able to apply for permanent residency, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So retirees are able to go directly into permanent residency, and this is showing that you have more income or more money in the bank, and Mexico is just going to give you the entire rest of your life to be in Mexico without having to go through any kind of renewal process going back into the office. So that's permanent residency. Income requirement here is about $7,800 a month, or a salary of about $94,000 a year. So that is if you're going the monthly route, but you can also go the I have this much money in the bank route, and that is about $300,000. So if you've got $300,000 in your retirement accounts, your checking account, your savings account, you'll be able to go to permanent residency if you're retired. Now, this is something that has changed recently. My wife and I, although we're not retired, were able to get permanent residency 5 years ago. But now there seems to be a requirement that they want you to be retired or about to be retired or whatnot. So if you're older, this is going to be easier to go directly to permanent residency. If you're younger, they're going to want you to start out with temporary residency and work your way up to permanent residency. It's just going to cost a little bit more along the way because you've got to go through a little bit more process, a little bit more government forms, and a little bit more visits to the government, and each of those has a cost. But that cost, if you're able to go directly into permanent residency, is about $375 US. Those are the fees that are required to go and get your permanent residency card, which is a green card. And that's what you use to get across the border back and forth. You can go through the citizen line at the airport once you have that card. Saves you a lot of time, especially if you're going to a real tourist airport like Cabo San Lucas, something like that, where the non-citizen lines are just kind of crazy. The citizen lines, they let people through much more quickly. You just show them your green card and your passport from the US, and you'll be set to go. So another option that you could choose is to be a tourist, and you could be a perpetual tourist by going back and forth across the border and returning to Mexico. I'm not sure it's legal. I think it gets to be in a little bit of a gray area if you're doing that a lot. But I do know some people who are in Mexico. They're part-timers in Mexico. They spend every winter down in Mexico, but they spend less than 6 months in Mexico, and then they go back to the United States where they have a house or something, and they live up there for the summers and return to Mexico. Perfectly legitimate to be a tourist for that entire time that you're living in Mexico, especially if you're renting. Very simple to do that. Just go in, become a tourist. I think the fee is about $40 at the border. It's included in your plane ticket if you fly in. And then you got your tourist. A lot of people call it a tourist visa, but it's really a tourist permit. For visas, there's a lot of countries. Most countries, if you're watching this channel, you probably have the ability to come into Mexico on just a FMM or a tourist permit. But a number of other countries across Africa or Asia or Eastern Europe, maybe, those countries are less likely to have that process. And you have to go through a visa process, which is just a little bit more complicated. But I'm not going to go into a lot about that. But just so you know, a tourist option exists, and it usually exists for up to 6 months, especially if you have a return plane ticket that you can show when you get your passport stamped at the airport or at your land border crossing. Now, the last option is something that exists right now in 2020, at the end of 2024, and I haven't heard about this ending anytime soon. It's called the regularization program. I don't have all the details myself because I haven't done it myself, but the idea here is if you've been in Mexico recently and you've overstayed your visa, so you had one of those 180-day visas and it expired, but you stayed in the country anyway, you have the option to essentially get amnesty. You've got to pay some more fees, so you've got to pay the fee for the temporary residency because that's what they're going to give you. They're going to give you the temporary residency without you having to meet any of the financial requirements. So this is a really, really valuable option for people who can't meet the financial requirements, but have been in Mexico in the recent past and then have overstayed their visa. So it's possible to get a visa, overstay it purposely for the purpose of using this option. So the fees here are about $850. That includes fines for overstaying your visa and going through the temporary residency process. But at the end, you're going to end up with a temporary residency card, which gives you 4 years to be in the country. You have to renew after at least the first year. And then after that, you can become a permanent resident. So this is a way, depending on your situation, you might be able to bypass all of this. Now, let's go into how does it happen? What is the process like? So the process for the temporary or permanent resident visa has to start in the United States. And the process for the regularization program has to start in Mexico. So if you've been in Mexico and you've overstayed your visa, you're going to be here when you start this process. And that makes it really convenient too. Otherwise, if you want a temporary or permanent residency, you're going to have to, if you're down in Mexico, you've got to leave Mexico, go to a consulate in the United States. So usually consulate in a big city near your home. We went to Portland and that worked out great. Each consulate, though, does have different requirements. So the financial requirements vary a lot because of how they do the formula differently. And the Mexico Relocation Guide is once again a really great spot to get the most up-to-date information on which consulates are having which financial requirements. Like I said, some of them are slightly higher than the numbers that I gave you, and some of them are significantly lower. That said, there are some that won't allow you to be from an area outside. And I think Texas, which has some of the best numbers, you have to prove that you're a resident of the area or a resident of Texas or something like that. So check around with the consulate, see which one might match your financial requirements if you're close to the line, and then see if you're going to be allowed to go through a process with them, and then you'll make an appointment. So you'll make an appointment at the Mexican consulate in a nearby city to you. You go in with all your paperwork. You've probably submitted an application in advance. You go in, you've got all your copies of your different income statements or your bank statements and whatnot. Give it to them. They go through a process. There's a little bit of a fee up in the United States. And then they will give you, I think it's inside your passport, they will give you something called, I believe it's called a canje. So once you get that process in the United States wrapped up at the consulate, you then start the clock of 6 months. You've got 6 months to cross into Mexico. So lots of flexibility there. And then you come across the border. Now there's a little bit of a process at the border or at the airport. Just make sure that the border agent sees that canje page in your passport, and they will give you a 30-day visa to be in the country for 30 days. So you don't want them to stamp you as a tourist and give you 180 days, because then you're going to mess up the entire process and have to start over. So make sure that the immigration agent sees that page and make sure that you get your passport stamped. Now, I do have a video about this where if you're doing this at the border, at a land border, it's really easy to skip this step. It's not like the United States where they make sure that you go through the entire process at the border. When you're coming into Mexico, it's possible to just get waved through and you think everything's fine, but everything is not fine because you didn't follow the process that you were supposed to follow. The guard at the border didn't know what was required of you. So he thought, well, maybe this person already has a passport, but they don't check the passport. So anyway, just be cognizant of that when you make it to the border. Get your passport stamped. And then from that point, you've got a 30-day clock that starts ticking. And that is the point at which you need to go to the immigration office in whatever town you're going to be living in and finish the process there. Each town's a little bit different. You can hire someone to help you through this process if you want, or you can do it on your own. It's a little bit tricky. If you've got a tight timeline, I do recommend hiring someone so that you use your time as wisely as possible. It can take about 2 weeks for this process to complete, but you got to get it started within 30 days. And then at the end of that, you're going to get presented with your card. It's got your picture on it. They collect your biometrics, your eye scan and your fingerprint scan and things like that. And then you've got a card either valid for temporary 4 years or valid for the rest of your life. So last up in this video, I want to give you some tips. And the first tip is to have patience with this process. Oftentimes it is difficult to get an appointment up in the United States, especially now in 2025 as we have a change in administration and the administration is focusing on deporting people from the United States. That means that the Mexican consulates are getting busy with Mexican citizens. And so it's going to be a little bit harder, I think, for you to go through this process because the embassies are going to be a lot more busy with their own citizens instead of trying to help citizens from the U.S. to become permanent or temporary residents. It's not going to be as high of a priority, especially if things get ugly. If the U.S. isn't being welcome to Mexicans, then Mexico might not be so welcome to people from the United States. So just something to think of. Always be patient with the process and have the utmost kindness. In Mexico, politeness and kindness go a long way, and they are expected. So if you send off an email to a consulate saying like, hey, when can I get an appointment? You will have just insulted them because you didn't start with good morning, how are you doing, that type of thing. So every conversation here starts with these little niceties, and people who are working in the consulate are Mexican. So you want to make sure that you're treating them with respect and also using some of those niceties that they're used to, and you'll get a lot further in the process. Another tip is to give it a try. If you're thinking about moving to Mexico, we've been to Mexico as tourists a number of times, but then we ended up buying a house a little bit on a whim while we were here as tourists, kind of like some people buy timeshares. We bought a house that way. I would recommend coming down. You can come down as a tourist, or you can come down in that process of getting your residency set up. But go beyond being a tourist. So don't just go to Cabo and go to an all-inclusive resort and have people wait on you hand and foot and pay for things with dollars and speak English only. Get out of those areas, get into the real Mexico, see what it would be like to actually live here and explore the country, see which areas are best for you. And of course, you can do a lot of this exploring online through YouTube channels like this one. And there's a lot of great resources. I mentioned the Mexico Relocation Guide a number of times. Not only is the guide great, but the YouTube channel is wonderful too. They interview people around the country. So do some exploring online, do some exploring in person, go beyond being a tourist. And my last piece of advice, my last little tip for you is to do it. You can go through the process. You can become a permanent resident of Mexico if you meet these different requirements. And then you've got that card. So it doesn't take a heck of a lot. It isn't very expensive. And you have the opportunity to live in another country permanently. So especially with the way things are going in the United States, with the political heat just keeps rising and rising and rising. Who knows how things are going to go? It's really great to have that in your back pocket, is the ability to go to Mexico and spend as much time as you need down there while things are getting a little bit, whatever they're getting in the United States. Or you just want to get out of the US, you're tired of the winter, you're tired of your boss, you're tired of whatever it is. You've opened up the opportunities to get to move to Mexico once you have either the temporary or permanent residency. So those are my suggestions for you. Let me know down in the comments below if this was helpful. Let me know if YouTube did a good job suggesting that I make this video. Let me know what other videos that you think I should be making. And of course, subscribe to this channel and share it with all your friends. So that's an awful lot of things for you to do now. Hopefully you'll do that. And also I've got up on the screen now some videos, one here, something like that, somewhere, that would be great for you to watch for some inspiration about other people who have done it before you. I thank you so much for watching, and hasta luego.